Racestar 3035. Found these on Banggood, and this was kind of an interesting one. Slightly lower pitch, but also a quad blade, and it actually manages to make up in ultimate thrust because of that. The weight here is a little on the heavy side, 2.1 grams on the heavier side of what we've seen on a lot of these. Almost 30,000 RPM out of it, so it's loaded heavier than the 3040 despite having the lower pitch. As I mentioned, the thrust is actually a little bit better. We're getting about 5% better thrust compared to the Rotorex 3040. So that's nice. That's always been kind of a hard bar to meet. But unfortunately, the efficiency cost is quite heavy. An extra about 4 amp draw at peak, or an additional 50 watts, 180 watts instead of 130. You can also see the how much less thrust you get at 100 watt draw, basically 20% down on the amount of thrust we get out of 100 watts of electrical power. Here's our baseline thrust over RPM. The extra blade is really doing well for it, and we're getting a significant gap in thrust compared to the Rotorex 3040. So certainly if you can spin this prop fast enough, you can get the power out of it, but you can also see how big of a difference the extra loading on the motor, the RPM cost there at the top end. Looking at the thrust performance over the throttle range of the test, we carry just a pretty regular gap throughout the entire thing. Through most of this range, this is about a 20 grams gap until the very top, where it starts to taper off just slightly. And you can see that larger little tick bar at the end from voltage sag, how much heavier that's hitting the power system compared to the Rotorex. The efficiency chart really shows just how much less efficient that option actually is. Way more power at peak to almost 190 watts peak versus our 135, and a really huge gap at anywhere with basically any usable thrust. You have that same efficiency, just like we've got a fairly consistent amount of extra thrust at most of the throttle range, we also have a fairly consistent lack of efficiency over the entire range as well. So everything above about 1/3 throttle, the efficiency just drops through the floor, and at our worst here, we're down to about 1.72, which is pretty dreadful. But also interesting, really interesting once again, the heavy multi-bladed prop getting a better peak of efficiency down really low. Now this is like 1/8 throttle, so this isn't even at hover, but at really low RPM it is making better use of it. Temperature draw, not really much to look at, very similar between the two props. The Racestar hitting it a little harder a little earlier in the test and sustaining a higher temperature rise for longer, but really not much to see here. And then acceleration is basically what we've come to expect from these heavier props. Our Rotorex 3040 hitting about 700,000 degrees a second, and the heavier prop only getting almost 500,000. So you're definitely taking a hit in peak acceleration there from the extra weight, and it's fairly in line with what we've seen from other similar weighted props in the past. Maybe only slightly slower. I want to say those are tended to hit more the 550, 600 range, but in the ballpark, certainly not the end of the world.